So, a year and a half after the Idaho 4 murders, I am still seeing people going after Dylan and Bethany, the two surviving roommates, with a vengeance. And it really angers me and saddens me because those two girls lost their friends and yet turn around and have to face all kinds of criticism because they didn't realize that their friends were being murdered. And so they didn't know until they woke up later. Now, Dylan was awake. Sounds like Bethany was as well, because it said they used their phones for forensic examination to determine the times of the murders. We have heard rumors that they were texting each other. That's not proven yet. But from what we know from the probable cause affidavit, none of the noises would be anything that would sound like your roommates are being murdered. Dylan heard what she thought was Kaylee playing with her dog, crying. Somebody saying there's someone here, and then somebody saying I'm here to help you. Isolated, without knowing what we know, because we have the luxury of hindsight, you wouldn't have thought anybody was being murdered. The neighbor's security camera picked up a thud, whimpering, and a dog barking. Again, not noises that would be indicative of somebody being murdered. Your mind wouldn't jump to that. And yes, Dylan saw the suspect walk by, but your mind goes into protection mode. And she could have thought it was a friend of somebody in the house. She could have thought it was a stranger and registered that maybe there's a problem, but not to the point of murder. Your mind just wouldn't automatically jump to that. And there's been several cases where people have heard the murders taking place or didn't hear anything at all, even though they were in the same house with paper-thin walls. Yet people still sit there and claim Dylan and Bethany should have known and should have called 911 immediately. So I'm going to delve into some of these situations that were similar. So we're going to start with probably one of the most famous murders. I'm talking about the murders of Sharon Tate and 3 of her friends by the Manson family. Now, in something that's eerily similar to what Dylan experienced when she saw the perpetrator walk by, Abigail Folger was in a guest bedroom and saw one of the Manson family members walk by her room, and Abigail waved to the person. She didn't know that that was somebody there to murder her. She had no sense of danger. She waved to the intruder that had just broken into her house. So, again, you don't always know the situation unless you're in it. And on site, on the property, was a caretaker, Stephen Garrettson. Here's what he had to say. Garrettson said he recalls a lot of strange things going on that night. At one point, he saw people run past the guest house and heard someone rattle the doorknob before they were scared away by a barking dog. He learned nothing of the murders until the following day when police showed up. That was likely when Abigail Folger and her boyfriend Wojtek Fryczowski were running out by the pool area to try to escape the Manson family. They were being chased and being stabbed to death. And the caretaker just thought it was people running around, probably goofing off at the pool area. Also, people in the vicinity heard noises that night, but also had no reason to believe anybody was being murdered. One neighbor said on the night of the murders, there were 2 parties going on. They stayed up late that night. They were in bed reading and had just snapped off the light. Just dozed off when something woke me almost immediately. I reached over and had just turned on the light when I heard a loud shot, a woman's scream, and another shot. The second shot seemed more muffled than the first one. The neighbor said at first I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard other noises, so I figured the party was still going on. I paid no attention to what the noises were. They didn't register. All I know is I thought the party was still on. There's a lot of screaming and yelling in this neighborhood on the weekends, he said, and you get sort of used to it. What woke him up, he doesn't know, but he stayed away long enough after the shots and screams to hear cars driving down a road. But he said there's a lot of traffic that night. He said the next morning, the screaming of the maid brought perspective. He said if he had looked out the window, he would have seen the murderers cutting the phone wires. I mean, that's how close his view was. So you think about that for a second. He actually heard the murders going on, but just thought they were party noises. Now, from the Manson murders in California, we're going to go to Buffalo, New York in 1992, where Alana Zabel was sharing a house with 4 other roommates, sorority sisters from Chi Omega, and her roommate had gone home before her that night, and when she went back to the house, she was locked out. So she climbed through a window, and she noticed a strange smell right away, but didn't really think anything of it because she had been out partying and was drunk. So Zabel said when she entered the home, she was overcome by an odd smell. I was drunk and didn't understand why it smelled weird, and I just crashed in my room. A short time later, she said she heard someone enter her room briefly before leaving. She thought it was one of her roommates, but it turned out the intruder was the attacker. Now, that person had attacked her roommate. And when she came home that night, she had heard noises from her roommate's room, but didn't have any reason to believe that it was somebody beating her roommate almost to death. She said she heard heavy breathing from her roommate's room, but had assumed she was with her boyfriend. The next morning around 9 a.m., she entered the victim's room to ask her to move her car and had been overpowered by the stench of vomit. Now, she has also said that she had the delayed response and felt guilty about that because she went to sleep that night despite hearing muffled heavy breathing in her roommate's room. She only called the cops the next day. Alana Zabel has reached out to Dylan Mortensen because of the similarities. Zabel said it was only when the paramedics arrived and commented on the amount of blood in the room that she noticed that her roommate's room was covered in it. Her psychologist said that it was a protective mechanism. The wall had what looked like red bloom marks. She said she can say that you don't know how you would react or respond in a similar situation until you're there. I've lived life with guilt for not calling 911 sooner my entire life. I never saw the attacker. Well, but she said she did because somebody went by her room. But at the time, she didn't realize that was the attacker. And never saw signs of a break-in until she found her housemate the next morning. She can imagine the guilt that the surviving roommates in Idaho are feeling. She said when you're living in an environment like college where having strangers in your house is normal, it's hard to fathom a tragedy like this. So a lot of similarities there. She heard noises, muffled sounds, saw somebody go by her bedroom. Didn't register that it was somebody that had broken in and had beaten her roommate to within inches of death. And so she didn't call 911 until several hours later. So now let's go to Washington State. Ted Bundy's first victim, Karen Sparks. And she lived in a house with male roommates. So when people say, oh, Brian Koberger wouldn't have gone into a house with several people, including a man, let's just remember that people that want to murder aren't deterred by how many people are in a house or even that it's men also in the house. So let's look into this Karen Sparks situation further. So Karen Sparks was Ted Bundy's first known victim, and she survived her encounter with him. She believes that it was one of her male roommates talking in his sleep next door that spooked Bundy and prompted him to flee. She believes, as she said, that's why he didn't haul her away like other girls. She said, I remember seeing some guy looking at me, and I thought, gosh, maybe it was just a figment of my imagination because it was so quick. It was just a flash, and I thought, well, nobody's going to hurt me, I'm living with these guys, you know what I mean? Who's going to hurt me? But Bundy snuck into her room after she fell asleep and beat her violently. She was left unconscious and bleeding in bed for hours until about 7 p.m. that night when one of her roommates came down to check on her. Bob came down and he saw blood on my pillow and he called 911 right away. He called my mom and told my mother, Karen must have fallen down the stairs. It's bad. So only after she was taken to the hospital did they realize the enormity of her injuries and what had happened. So this was a woman that shared a house with men, and none of them heard her being attacked. And Ted Bundy was brazen enough to go into a house that a woman shared with 3 other men. Now we're going to stay in Washington and go to Ted Bundy's next known victim, Linda Healey. She shared a house with other women. Similar situation. No one realized anything had happened for hours. So Linda Healey was 21 years old and lived in a house not far from the University of Washington campus with 4 other women. At 5:30 a.m., her alarm went off as usual for an early morning stint at the radio station she had worked at. But when her roommate Barbara Little went into her room after hearing the alarm, she discovered Healey was gone. Although the 2 rooms were separated by only a thin partition, she hadn't heard any disturbances during the night. There was no obvious visible evidence that Healey had met with foul play, but her employer soon called the house to ask why she hadn't come into work. Her roommates then noticed other disturbing clues. The back door they always kept locked was open, and none of the women saw Healey on campus that afternoon or at home that evening, despite a dinner Healey had planned to have for her family. When police were called, they were also struck by the condition of the room. The room was very neat, and there was no signs of foul play except some blood on the pillow and on the head area of the sheets on her bed. They also noticed her bed had been made up neatly, but in the closet they found her nightgown covered in blood around the neck, and the only clothes that were missing were the ones she had been wearing the night before, suggesting that whoever had abducted her had taken off her pajamas and gotten her dressed. A pink satin pillowcase that usually lay on her bed and her backpack were missing. So, roommates didn't notice anything was wrong for hours. They didn't see her on campus. She never returned for dinner, so then they finally started getting worried. She had been abducted while 3 other people were in the same house and no one heard a thing. And obviously she was one of Ted Bundy's murder victims. So now we're going to go across the country to Florida, where Ted Bundy entered a sorority house at Florida State University. Again, a house filled with people. As I mentioned before, it doesn't deter someone that is intent on murder. And he went into that sorority house and he attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them. One of the women in the sorority was coming home from a night out, and they believed the car dropping her off is what scared Bundy away to where he left. She saw him running down the stairs. She was alarmed enough that she woke up some other sorority sisters, but no one still knew what happened until about 5 minutes later, one of the victims crawled out of her room. Now, if that victim hadn't come out, who knows how long it would have been before anybody realized that there were people attacked and dying, and one person at that time dead. So let's take a look at that. So they're talking about Diane Cosson. and how many of the Chi Omega sisters had gathered in her room until about midnight. And she had noticed Margaret Bowman walking past and said something like, "How you doing?" Just a regular sort of night, Costin recalls. It was the last time she saw Bowman alive. A few hours later, as Costin slept on the other side of a paper-thin wall, Bowman was being strangled with a pair of nylon pantyhose, her skull crushed with massive blows from Bundy's oak limb club. Costin had gone to bed a little after 1 a.m. The door was ajar, and in her half-sleep, she did notice later that the hall light clicked off. That seemed odd, she thought. Her roommate, the last one out there, should have turned it off. It is believed that Bundy was already in the house. Now, 10 minutes later, another sorority sister leaving the bathroom noticed that the hall was suddenly dark. She almost headed down the hall for a drink of water, then changed her mind. She believes to this day that if she had gone for the drink and turned the light on, she may have stopped the frenzied killing. For 11 years, Costin, Nelson, and the other sisters who slept nearby, even the victims who survived Bundy's attack, have anguished over such questions as to why they didn't hear anything as their friends lay dying and what they could have done to help. Costin said, "My bed was next to hers with just that thin wall between us. When one of us was getting dressed in the morning, the other would hear the closet door open." That's Nita Neary that came home late and testified that she saw a man with a sharp, thin nose leaving through the front door with a sticker club. And then 5 minutes later, Karen Chandler stumbled from her room. Her sorority sisters, who had been wakened by an alarmed Nita Neary, stared in horror. And I'm not going to go into all her injuries. You can look these up. So those women had what ifs, because they were right there in the same house where 4 people were attacked, 2 were killed, and didn't hear anything. They were alarmed by lights off or on that shouldn't have been, but not enough to think that anything was abnormal. And if not for the one that had crawled out into the hallway, we don't know how long it would have taken for anyone to discover the 4 that had been attacked. So they had a lot of regrets, but I don't believe there was anything they could have done differently, because at the time they didn't know anybody had been hurt. Now we're going to stay in the state of Florida, and we're going to go to University of Florida in Gainesville, where Danny Rolling killed 5 people. So in the early morning hours of Friday, August 24th, Rolling broke into an apartment shared by 2 university freshmen, Sonia Larson and Krista Powell. He found Powell asleep on the downstairs couch and stood over her briefly, but did not wake her up, choosing instead to go upstairs to a bedroom where Larson was asleep. He murdered Larson, first taping her mouth shut to stifle her screams, and then stabbing her to death with a K-bar. She died trying to fend him off. Now, if she was trying to fend him off, obviously there would have been some noises. But that either didn't awaken her roommate downstairs, or she didn't think anything was odd, because Rolling went back downstairs, found her on the couch, and proceeded to murder her. He then stayed in the apartment and did other unspeakable things. Now, the next day when the bodies were found, one neighbor would recall that he had heard someone showering and playing loud music early on a Friday morning. It was George Michael's face. Then there had been a loud banging sound. He assumed that the girls had been hanging pictures on the wall. So what that neighbor actually heard was the intruder in the apartment murdering the girls, but he assumed it was people listening to music and hanging pictures, because it didn't sound like anything horrific being done. Again, you have to put yourself in that situation, and the noises you're hearing aren't going to make you go to murder. So let's go from Florida to California, the Hillside Stranglers. And they brazenly abducted a young woman on the street in front of her house. And there was an eyewitness. So Lauren Wagner had been coming home from classes late at night and had pulled up across the street from her parents' house. Her car was found the next morning with the door ajar. Now, a neighbor, Beulah Stouffer, had seen Lauren pull over to the curb around 9 o'clock in the evening. Two men had pulled their car beside her. There was some kind of disagreement, and Lauren ended up in the car with them. Lauren's father questioned the neighbor and found out that Beulah did not realize that Lauren had been abducted. She thought that she had just witnessed a quarrel, and she wasn't even sure it had been Lauren. Now, in the meantime, Bianchi and Buono had called Beulah and also threatened her. But Beulah had been so terrified by seeing the incident that she did not even tell her husband, who had been home the whole time. It says the horror of the whole thing threw her into a violent asthma attack. So here was an eyewitness that actually witnessed an abduction of a young woman, and she didn't even tell her husband about it. Again, we don't know how we would react. She saw something but didn't even register right away that it was an abduction. She thought it was a disagreement until later when she was threatened by the Hillside Stranglers. She never called 911. Now, let's go to Calgary, Canada, and the Brentwood Five. And this also shows how somebody can be sleeping upstairs and not hear an attack until after it's over, but also how quick the stabbing deaths of 5 people can be in one house. So the Brentwood Five, otherwise known as the Calgary stabbings, were when a man named Matthew DeGrude went to a house party and stabbed 5 people to death. One of the residents of the house who survived had gone to bed earlier in the night and only heard the screaming afterwards. So they did not wake up while the attacks were going on, only afterwards. So a group of partygoers had gone to get food, and that left the 5 that were murdered in the house along with the person that went upstairs to sleep. So one man named Hong was lying down and sleeping on a couch. Other partygoers, Hunter, Paris, and Segura, were seated on the couch under the window. And then Rathwell was in the kitchen with the perpetrator, DeGrude. The victims, none of them knew the accused. And then Terry Lewis tried to sleep upstairs. DeGrude used a kitchen knife and stabbed Rathwell 7 times, Hunter 6 times, Segura once, Paris 4 times, and Hong 4 times. The stabbings occurred quickly and unexpectedly. The victims had little, if any, opportunity to react. Hunter and Segura were stabbed while still on the couch, while Paris was stabbed in the dining room as she tried to escape. Hong was asleep when he was killed, and Hunter survived the initial attack and was able to run from the residence. Now, when first officers arrived at the scene, within 4 minutes of the 911 call, they found Hunter on the front lawn alive but fatally wounded. Everybody else was dead. The stabbings took less than 2 minutes, and 5 people were dead. And paramedics arrived within 4 minutes, but still couldn't save any of them. The one that had ran out to the lawn was fatally wounded. This tells you, again, that a murderer doesn't care how many people are in a house. They don't care who witnesses it, honestly. And somebody was upstairs sleeping but never heard any screaming until the aftermath. They didn't hear the victims being killed. Only the people screaming afterwards that came back with the food. And it shows you how quickly stabbings can happen, how fast people can die. So even if Dylan and Bethany had called 911 when Dylan had seen Kohberger in the house, it wouldn't have mattered. No one would have been saved. The coroner had already confirmed that. The Idaho 4 would not have survived. So Dylan and Bethany's actions or inaction are irrelevant to the guilt or innocence of Bryan Kohberger. Their actions have nothing to do with what happened that morning. Someone broke into the house. Someone killed them. Bryan Kohberger is on trial for that. Bethany and Dylan could have called 911 immediately or 911 8 hours later, and it wouldn't change the outcome. And the people that are saying, oh, I would have called 911, stop it, because you don't know that you would have. Unless you are a 20-year-old in that exact same situation, hearing the noises they heard, you do not know what you would have done. And I've had people say, oh, you're assuming Bryan Kohberger's guilty. Well, yeah, you're damn right I am, just because I believe the evidence shows he is, but we'll see at trial. But these same people that are upset that people are calling Bryan Kohberger guilty have no problem attacking Dylan and Bethany and saying they should be arrested, that they should be charged with crimes. Okay. Law enforcement cleared them. Those young women did nothing wrong. And you know they will be living with regret for the rest of their lives, survivor's guilt for the rest of their lives. I was wondering if they could have done something different, and they couldn't have. It wouldn't have changed the outcome. So I'm just asking people to show some grace for the two survivors, because hindsight is always 20/20, and unless you're in that situation, you don't know what you would have done at the time.